Welcome, everyone. As you find your way in, please grab whatever seat is available. It is my total delight, as the director of the museum here, to welcome you for what will be a very, very special conversation with a very dear friend of mine. My name is Adam Levine. I'm the Edward Drummond and Florence Scott Libby director here at TMA. And as Larry Nichols, our curator emeritus, who is the curator of the magnificent Caravaggio exhibition, was contemplating not only how to bring these remarkable artworks to Toledo, but also how to activate them for our audience, he said, "You must have the bishop come and speak." And of course, as the audience suggests, this was a good idea. Now, as you'll hear in his bio, this is not the bishop's first appearance at the museum. In fact, he's been intimately connected in programs over his tenure here in Toledo. And I know that you are in for a treat, as I have gotten to know him over the past decade. On October 22nd, 2014, the Most Reverend Daniel E. Thomas was named by Pope Francis as the 8th bishop of the Diocese of Toledo. Bishop Thomas was born and raised in Philadelphia, where he earned both a Bachelor and Master's of Arts degree from St. Charles Borromeo Seminary. He also This will be the first of many such gaffes this evening. He also earned a licentiate in sacred theology in 1989 from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. In 1990, he was assigned to serve as the Holy See, as an official of the then Congregation of Bishops. During his 15 years there, Bishop Thomas also served as an adjunct spiritual director for the Pontifical North American College Seminary in Rome. In 1995, he was named chaplain to His Holiness Monsignor, and in 2005 was named a Prelate of Honor, both by Pope John Paul II. In 2005, Bishop Thomas was appointed pastor of Our Lady of the Assumption Parish in Stratford, Pennsylvania, and in 2006 was named by Pope Benedict XVI as an auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, where he served until coming to the Diocese of Toledo in 2014. Bishop Thomas is honored and delighted to return to the Toledo Museum of Art for such a special event. In November 2014, just weeks after being installed as Bishop of Toledo, he spoke on the liberation of St. Peter, the monumental painting by Luca Giordano, pictured just there, at an event to celebrate the acquisition of that work by the museum by then William Hutton, Senior Curator of European and American Art before 1900, Larry Nichols, whose title rivals in difficulty only apparently St. Charles Borromeo Seminary. He returned to the Toledo Museum of Art in February 2018 for the special event, Bishop Daniel Thomas in conversation with Adam Levine. There are multiple Adam Levines in the world, for those of you who don't know, but that is this Adam Levine, on the treasures of early Christian art that were presented in glorious splendor. We were talking about it just recently. It's almost 5 years ago to the day that exhibition opened, Valentine's Day 2018, and it was not opening weekend that we had our talk. So rather remarkable. This, therefore, is Bishop Thomas's third presentation at your Toledo Museum of Art. Please give him the warmest of welcomes. So, Bishop Thomas, and you are on, you're live?
I believe I am.
He is live, excellent. So, Bishop Thomas, you were telling me before we came on stage that given that this is your third appearance here, that there's someone else of repute in the Catholic Church who has a funny thing to say about occurrences in threes.
Right. There's a very dear friend of mine who talks about when something becomes a tradition. So his name is Cardinal Timothy Dolan from New York. And he says that if you do it one time, it's an innovation. If you do it 2 times, it's a repetition. But if you do it 3 times, it becomes a tradition. So I'm delighted that this is now a tradition. So we look for the next opportunity.
And there will be other opportunities. We've already been plotting what they might be, and we will one-up Cardinal Dolan and figure out what is fourth, what comes beyond tradition. given your distinguished history, but so much time spent in Rome, which is really the locus of this exhibition about Caravaggio's time in Rome, talk about your first experience of Caravaggio's work and perhaps a meaningful experience with Caravaggio's work in Rome.
When Adam presented these questions, it's always good because the bishop insists, what are you going to ask? So I know how I can answer. But this first question is fascinating because when I read it, I thought, what is my first experience of Caravaggio's work? That would have to be as a very young person looking at art and art books. And I was fascinated by Caravaggio from the very beginning. So really, that was my first experience of him. But then I think, as all of us like to play and define with words, the other part of it was, what was my experience that is an actual experiential moment standing before a Caravaggio? Now, I don't know how many of you have already been through the exhibit, but kudos, if I may give a kudo to Larry and say, what an extraordinary installment. The audio is amazing. The wall colors are fantastic. And the fact that you can stand in one place and see all four Caravaggios at once is extraordinary. So standing before them, as I did the other day and had a surprise visit by Adam, standing before them is its own experience. So in Rome, I would say there are a number of which I had that kind of an experience. And the first would be the deposition of Christ from the cross, which is in the Vatican museums, which is also monumental. It's massive. A few which are still in their original location. And I do want to emphasize that obviously Caravaggio was being commissioned to make these pieces, and they were intended to raise the mind and heart of those who viewed them. That is, to inspire faith and to be able to draw those who viewed them into the mystery that they were representing. So in the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo, there are two which are literally across from each other. It's almost so tight, you can hardly view them appropriately. And they are the conversion of St. Paul and the crucifixion of St. Peter. So just to experience them in that way is quite something. And if I may jump to another experience, with your permission, Adam, that was not in Rome, and that is just a couple falls ago, I was privileged to lead a pilgrimage of faithful from the Diocese of Toledo. We had a bus of 50, and we did a pilgrimage to Italy, but first to Spain. And yours truly had never been to Toledo, Spain. So it was the first time that the Bishop of Toledo went to and met with the Archbishop of Toledo. And the gift was that as I brought a gift from my favorite museum, this one, I went to buy something in glass to bring to him. And from the museum, I want to say it was an Applebaum, would that be correct?
Yeah.
Who is a local artist in glass. And I brought to the Archbishop a gift from this museum so that he was able to make the connection. And we met in the grand sacristy, which is as large as this room. And there is St. John the Baptist, which is massive. It must be 5 feet by 4 feet. And that was an experience because I thought, here I am giving a gift to the Archbishop of Toledo from Toledo, and I'm encountering one of my favorite artists in the entire world. And it was that John the Baptist. So these experientials, I think, also add to the moment of experiencing the art and taking it in.
So we will come to some of the theological implications of Caravaggio's work in due course. But, if I may say, this might be the first time that you interacted with the Archbishop of Toledo, or the Bishop of Toledo interacted with the Archbishop of Toledo. I can tell you this stage will be the first and only time I am ever asked to give permission to a bishop to go on. That was quite something. Can't wait to tell my fiance about that.
That's what good friends do.
I appreciate that very much. You say whatever you like, dear sir. You are the draw. So given all of these experiences, surely you have a favorite Caravaggio painting.
Little children will ask me in grade schools, Bishop, what's your favorite prayer? Who's your favorite saint? And I say it's awfully difficult to narrow it down to one. So, but if I had to be pressed to narrow it down to one, I would say, because obviously of my name, it's the Doubting Thomas. And that painting, which of course is world renowned at this point, is particularly close to me because I have prayed with it, meditated over it on retreats, and I have used it very, very often in talks that I've given. And what is most unique, I think, is it's one of the most powerful expressions of, if you will, I'm going to say the uber humanism that comes out in Caravaggio, because it's in that painting where, and it was scandalous, I understand at the time that it was presented, where Christ is actually taking the hand of Thomas and thrusting it into his side, and his fingers are even covered by the flesh of the resurrected Jesus' side. It is a powerful, powerful work to me of the bodily resurrection, which of course Christians believe Jesus rose truly and bodily from the dead. And it's that kind of realism and humanism that I think just draws, and of course the tremendous, we'll talk about it, but the tremendous chiaroscuro and the incredible line, the diagonals, all of that is present in that painting. And for that reason, it's my favorite. And I used one of the Caravaggisti, we would say, a follower of Caravaggio, for the art on the holy card when I was ordained a priest, which someone just happens to have with him.
I do. I do. I was not there in 2006, on 26 July 2006, when the Most Reverend Daniel E. Thomas was ordained bishop with the Anima Christi prayer on the back. This is to scale, by the way. We expect you all to see this in the back. For reference of what this Guercino version of the picture looks like, you can look at our Guercino Latin Daughters at left to get a sense of the remarkable realism of that particular painter. So what an incredible story.
Well, yeah.
Now,
If I could just mention too, it's very, very close to me because I chose that obviously because of my name and an affection for St. Thomas, but also because my name is Thomas. My coat of arms is a play on words, as most heraldry is. And my motto is Dominus Deus et Deus Meus, which in Latin are the very words that Thomas spoke when he placed his hand into the side of Christ, my Lord and my God, which is the resurrection confession of faith of Thomas.
now, those are your favorite memories of Caravaggio. The first question asked about your memories about Caravaggio. Generally, the second question about a picture that was most meaningful to you. What about in your time at Rome? What about while in Rome? So you mentioned the experiences of Peter and Paul, right? But is there a particular painting or experience with a painting that resonates beyond all else?
Thank you, Adam. I think I would share, my first thought would be, people have heard me say, I judge religious art on whether or not it moves me to pray. So for me, I know that religious art is brilliant. This is my humble and incorrect perhaps opinion, but if it moves me to pray, then I believe it's excellent religious art. And I would really cite two examples, and they're both in Naples. So because of a visit to Naples, and Naples has a number of the Caravaggios. You should know too, in Rome itself, one of the churches that has at least three of the Caravaggios is San Luigi dei Francesi, which has a cycle of Caravaggios on St. Matthew, which is extraordinary. And of course, the call of St. Matthew as the tax collector at the table is one of the more famous. But I was particularly moved by experience in visiting Naples, and at least in the one case, again, an enormous painting, to be able to see a Caravaggio in the place where it was commissioned to be, that is a church, and to see I believe the title technically is the 7 Acts of Charity.
Mhm.
We would know it as the 7 Corporal Works of Mercy. It's a profound painting with tremendous movement that just, as all Caravaggio, you're just drawn in instantaneously. And I was very much drawn into it, realizing too, and we'll discuss, I think, a little bit later, at the time Caravaggio was painting, of course, it was the Counter-Reformation. And it was one of the efforts to see the church who had reformed herself to be able to recognize that these aspects of the church, which are directly related to Matthew's gospel, and where Jesus, at the separation of the goats and the sheep, says that I'll honor those who when did when did we see you? I honor you when you gave me something to drink, when I was hungry and you fed me, I was naked and you clothed me, I was in prison and you visited me, and that's this painting, which is profoundly connected to the gospel. And it was very deeply moving to realize that this is the work of the church, the corporal work of mercy that Jesus gave to her. The other was very profound because it is a massive painting of the flagellation of Christ. And that now is in, I believe it's in one of the museums in Naples at this point, originally in a church. And to see the suffering Christ, I can share that I was actually moved to tears, and to pray to see Christ suffering and being flogged for my sins. It was a deeply moving spiritual experience. So I would say, as Naples brings out great emotion, it brought out my emotion in front of these two Caravaggios.
What a remarkable story. And I think so we'll jump around a little bit, if that's okay with you. I haven't deviated from the questions yet, but I'm locked in. So one of the things that happens in art museums, it's a peculiar thing, is something goes on the wall or it goes on a pedestal and all of a sudden it's art. And art is somehow devoid from everything that was experienced in the biography of that object. Of course, all of these works have context, have histories, and have human relationships with humans, maybe better said, and interactions that have been experienced over a century and in some cases millennia. And one of the efforts of 21st century museology is to constitute those experiences in the way that we interpret artworks. So it is worth noting that virtually every one of the paintings in this room, not the ones necessarily right behind us, but most of the Counter-Reformation paintings, because these Baroque paintings were an instrument of the Counter-Reformation, or certainly reflective of Counter-Reformation approaches and ideas, have real religious meaning. They were meant to not just move people to prayer, but to articulate particular points of view. So I wonder then, Bishop, sort of if you could talk a little bit about your theological reflections on Caravaggio's style. And of course, we talk so much about form and style and how it was radical and influential, but of course the substrate for it to be influential was laid by this broader religious swelling in Rome at that time. So you could talk a little bit about Caravaggio and how his work dovetailed with, was operative in, whatever term you would use, the Counter-Reformation.
Sure. I think one of the things we see instantaneously is great chiaroscuro. So it's this dark and light. In a sense, he defines that. And everyone after that who copied it was making this effort. And in every one of his religious paintings and in many of the secular paintings, there is clearly this tension between the dark and the light. And even in, for example, the card sharps, which we'll talk about, there is this tension between moral themes. So even in the card sharps, there's good versus evil, dark versus light, the human versus the inhuman, the deceptive versus the honest. And it seems to me that, I don't know, we can't imagine, of course, there's tomes written on what Caravaggio might have been thinking when he painted these, but to imagine that he was impacted clearly, and we don't know what the conversation was between himself and Cardinal Francisco del Monte to be the patron, but he was obviously intended to draw out these themes. And there's so many allegories in his paintings. And I would also say, though, that the church herself in the Council of Trent, which was part of, obviously, the result of the Counter-Reformation, the church herself asked for art that would more deeply inspire the faithful. And part of that, of course, was, in many regards, up until that time, religious art was seen as idealized and perfect. But what Caravaggio did, he broke all that apart. And there are all sorts of art historians who talk about how he absolutely scandalized people because of how human his scenes were regarding the art. So, for example, I remember the first time I went into San Luigi dei Francesi, and one of the first things your eye looks at is a filthy foot of someone kneeling before the Madonna. So this human, this obviously this person, it could have represented a pilgrim that had come to Rome and had filthy feet. But the fact that it was so human, and of course, it emphasized that all of us are human, that Jesus was human, and that somehow that humanity is caught up in his painting. And in the process, and I think of the St. Francis that's here, but in the process, the human is then caught up into the divine. So the divine revelation and divine thematic is very present because it makes the person, it's so human, it draws the person in immediately, and one can relate to the humanity, and then as if you're part of the painting itself. And then you cannot not, in the canon law double negative, you cannot not be then drawn into the divine. And I believe that is one of his great contributions, and really a contribution to every single person from that time in the late 16th century up until this day that has viewed his paintings, and it can't help but be drawn in to the theme.
Well, you can see why we invite him back over and over again. I think he could be a curator here. It's remarkable. But because we're now going down this art historical path, let's go all the way there. And we don't have visual references for you because there's not a screen that would allow you to see all the way down there. But good news, we have the real paintings 100 yards away. Go take a look at them. So let's talk about the religious paintings first from the Wadsworth Athenaeum, St. Francis Assisian Ecstasy, and from the Detroit Institute of Arts, just up the road, Martha and Mary Magdalene. Remarkable pictures in their own rights, remarkable pictures respectively. So I wonder if you could reflect, having been now a number of times, and I have to tell you, when I ran into Bishop Thomas last weekend or 2 weekends ago visiting, he was incognito. And I learned a lot about how a bishop goes incognito. The zipper is all the way up. This is the key. This is the key.
Dressed exactly like this. No suit coat.
It was that the jacket was zipped all the way up. It was very, very good. Monsignor Kubaki sort of in the back as well, right? I saw him first. So I wonder if you could reflect on those pictures and talk a little bit how they accord with or deviate from scripture, and what that tells you about, or how you would interpret that through your lens, either religiously or otherwise.
Sure, and I must say how grateful I was that Adam bumped into me in the exhibit, because we were then able to go and look at each of them together, and of course to speak about them, which I was delighted for. Let's start with St. Francis. I think that would be appropriate.
Let's.
And of course, all of you know the story of Francis, but many people know only the Francis who loved birds and animals. But the Francis who received the very wounds of the crucified Christ. And as Catholics, we believe that there are those people in history who have actually received the sign, not just the symbol, but the actual pain and the sign of those wounds in their hands, in their feet, in their side, some others in other places, in their foreheads because of the crown of thorns, or on their backs because of the scourging. So the stigmata is a very real and scientifically proved and humanly profoundly painful reality. The actual stigmata, which was represented in art prior to this, almost always represented a crucifix, which had the crucified Christ. And from the 5 wounds, I think we actually have paintings of this in our museum, with streams of light coming from those wounds and going to the person. At least one commentator says that Caravaggio knew by the time he was painting that everyone knew what the stigmata was and meant, and that was intended. And so if you look at the painting, the first thing you notice, you really don't see, those wounds are not visible. And I was fascinated by that. But to get up close, there is only one wound visible, and it's visible through an opening in his habit, his Franciscan habit. And there's actually his own hand, I believe, is pointing to the wound. And of course, the wound is a wound of love, because of love that Christ had to die for us. And so he loves Francis so much, he's giving him a share in the mystical woundedness of his crucifixion. And the painting, quite uniquely, has the one eye closed and his right eye is just slightly opened and appears to be fixed in really a place that we can't see. So this mystical reality of his receiving the stigmata is represented even if you just look at his eye. But then there are so many other aspects of the painting, and there's different possible allegories, Adam, which are present. So one of the ones that one can think of immediately is the reference to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, who is suffering the evening before the crucifixion, and he's being presented a chalice by an angel who is presenting the suffering that will come to him. And of course, that's where he prays, Father, take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done. And so there's actually an angel even comforting Francis in that reality. So this painting by Caravaggio, Francis, has the angel behind him, actually. And here's, of course, once again, the chiaroscuro. Here's the angular division of the light and the dark, the light coming from an unknown space, and the angel is being illuminated, as is Francis. And I think the reality that this refers to the Garden of Gethsemane is a powerful draw into the painting. The other allegory, I think that's also, I should mention that, of course, just as the apostles that Jesus chose to go into the garden, Peter, James, and John, you may recall from the gospel, he said, stay here and pray, stay awake and pray. And of course, he went back and they were asleep. And in this painting, his brother Leo, who is a comrade, a friar, is asleep in the background. So the whole reference is very pronounced. And then there are, in the darkness, it's hard to see it, and I got up very close, I hope not too close for the security guards, but I got up very close so that I could see visually in the darkness of the background are these three figures who appear to be shepherds, and they're regarding the light, or at least the source of this light. And so one of the allegories is that this mystical experience of the passion of Jesus is a spiritual rebirth for Francis in the person of Christ. And so there is some reference, the possibility to the actual birth of Christ with these three shepherds in the background. And uniquely, and this is what Adam pointed out to me, I may have missed it, is that the flowers, I think are daisies, in the front of the painting, in the middle of the night, are blooming. And flowers don't bloom at night, obviously. They don't open at night. And then just in the background are these streaks of light, which could be either dusk or dawn, but it's so powerful in that regard. So those are just some of the reflections on France.
And before moving to Martha and Mary Magdalene, it's sort of the definition of liminality, and it has all sorts of Old Testamental precursors as well. I mean, it's so rich it's so rich and pregnant with meaning and multivalence. I think that's actually part of the power of it. But I also would encourage everyone two things as we talk about these pictures. One is artists don't do things by accident. So pay very close attention, as the bishop has demonstrated. And he gets extra marks because the background would not have always been that dark. There's been some discoloration over the years. That was the first Caravaggio to enter an American collection, actually, when it entered the Wadsworth Athenaeum's collection in Hartford. It's a remarkable picture. I also would encourage you to not just visit this evening. By show of hands, who's been to the exhibition already? Excellent. Come back. And I actually, I've reflected on that painting in light of the upcoming total eclipse. And I just would encourage you all to experience that painting before April 8th and then again after April 8th. I think that we'll have sort of a remarkable facsimile of that experience in Northwest Ohio over the next couple of months. So for what that's worth. But let's turn then to the second picture, where there is equal attention to detail in ways that I think are compelling for meaning. But talk a little bit about, again, your interpretation of that scene of Martha and Mary Magdalene, and its accordance with or deviation from scripture.
Right. I was fascinated, Adam, because as we know, oftentimes painters will take liberties to make, what shall we say, historical rearrangements. Perhaps that's the best word. But they'll often put into a scene folks who maybe were not in the scene. So on the one hand, we know it's entitled Martha and Mary. So there is one tradition from Western culture that says that the Mary, who was the sister of Martha and Lazarus, was in fact Mary Magdalene, who was the one who was repentant and from whom Jesus cast out demons, variously interpreted. There are other people who say that Mary Magdalene was not the Mary who was the sister and the sister of Martha and Lazarus, but at least for this case, I think we have to accept that the idea is that this is two sisters and they're encountering one another. This is one of those examples too, where they're foreshortened. So it's almost as if you're being invited into the painting and standing there at the table and encountering the two of them. It's extraordinary too, again, the dark light play, the angle that is leading your eye. And here I think there's another revelation, because it not unlike the Francis and these others, at least many people would say that Caravaggio captures a moment. So it's actually a moment being captured, and suddenly you're drawn into this moment in time. And the understanding is that this moment in time is the moment of her conversion. So Mary Magdalene is dressed very, would you say, sumptuously, and the other Martha is dressed rather simply. And fascinatingly, the references are quite something. And so if it's a conversion, if it's a moment of conversion, it's this revelation for Mary Magdalene that she's being converted in that moment by divine light from her former way of life to a way of life in Christ. And so what we get are these powerful symbols, first perhaps of her vanity. So on the table is a comb, an ivory comb, and I'm not sure, it's variously interpreted as a powder puff or something else.
For perfume.
Right, or
Yep.
perfume. And there is, of course, the reality of the way she's dressed. But then in her one hand, she's holding a white flower, which is a symbol of purity. And her other hand is resting on this convex mirror, which is very unique. But she's not looking into the mirror in a conceited way. She's not looking into the mirror to see her reflection in perhaps a prideful way. Her hand is on the mirror, and it's gently directed to a small triangle or a diamond of light. And the diamond of light appears to be coming from the unknown light source, which can only be the divine. And she's, in a sense, in this moment of conversion, directing the viewer to the divine. One very interesting aspect of this painting, and I'm not sure of the interpretation here, so I'm going out on a limb, Adam, and that is she's wearing a wedding ring, and the one finger is drawn up. One commentator says, and I don't know if any of you are doctors, you would know the technical terminology for when a person's hands have this literal physical anomaly where the finger comes up from their hand and it can't be put down. I forget the name of it. But they're saying that it may even be, he was showing the humanity even there of a body that is, imperfect. But here she is in this moment of conversion, and it's very clear she's encountering the divine and she's pointing to the divine in this reflection of light. Another fascination to me is, what is Martha doing? Because she's at the table and she's got her hand out, and it looks like she's enumerating on her fingers. So some wags might say that she was saying all the housework that Mary wasn't doing, that Martha was doing. She was enumerating the housework. But others are saying she's enumerating her sins that she's converting from. Others would say she's enumerating the miracles of Christ that Mary Magdalene is now going to encounter. So I think it allegorically and theologically, it's profoundly rich in symbolism.
It's back to this idea that there are so many different dimensions to unpack. And actually, while there was undoubtedly an intent, what is also true, as you've already alluded to this, the paintings invite one in. Saint Francis may be a little less so than some of the others, but when you look at the DIA picture, Martha and Mary, we're quite literally seated at the table. Now, some of that is very clever installation by Larry and Claude Fixler to put it at just that height. But you are literally at the table. You are part of the engagement. In the musicians and the card sharps, which we'll come to momentarily, parts of the picture project illusionistically out in a way that seems to enter our space out of the picture plane. So we're invited into these paintings, and the meaning there is quite profound. So we're invited not just in to the theological content, but we're also invited to give our interpretations as well in varied ways. Now, one other point about this painting before we move on, because of course, the light and darkness, that shadow and chiaroscuro that Bishop Thomas alluded to, was not invented, right? It was observed and studied, and there is at least some evidence or some suggestion that Caravaggio painted in a cellar, in a basement. So it is also possible that that convex mirror is reflecting a reality that he studied, and that was a single light source into a cellar from which he would have been working from models and figuring out how to depict this symbolism, but done in a way which was so realistic that it was startling. And the fingers, as you mentioned, are absolutely oriented to point to that light source. So on the one hand, he is making a profound theological point, and on the other, he is signaling his own virtuosity, right, for which he was so known, which sounds like lots of artists I know. So let us turn to the secular pictures then.
Thank you.
Of which there are two. One, a genre scene, the card sharps, showing a particularly daring affair for our Midwestern audience, showing an early game of euchre. And the other showing a more allegorical, quasi-mythological scene, though perhaps with a portrait of Caravaggio tucked in. So rather than dissecting these, so to ask a single question about these two, you already alluded to the fact that they were both owned by the same patron. You didn't say this, but you mentioned the patron, Cardinal Del Monte. So my question is, if you could own one of these two pictures, which would you own?
Well, the first disclaimer is I am not a cardinal.
No. No.
The second disclaimer is I'll be happy if you want to give me one to go home. But I would say of those two, I would have to choose the card sharps. I think, well, it's so fascinating, and I do have a comment about the feathers, but also I do see in that this tension and struggle between, you know, there's the deception that they're cheating. And of course, for those who have not looked it up, as I have in the dictionary, card sharps means those who cheat at cards, and card sharks, which I remember my father saying, comes from card sharps. And I love words. So it's fascinating because here is this youthful person who's clearly being cheated. It would appear that he's innocent, and he's being taken by these two schmoes who are unbelievable. The chicanery is unbelievable. You know, the one is taking the cards from behind his back, and the other one has this massive eye who's cheating by looking at what's in his hand. And he also has his hand up with his fingers telling his friend what's in the hand of the poor innocent other third fellow. So I think it's such a great symbol of good and evil, of cheating and honesty, of innocence, and shall we say non-innocence. And I think that's why I would, because it has a moral, for me, it has a moral theme. Yeah. But can I talk about the feathers?
I was going to ask you. You whetted our appetite.
Well,
We need- yeah.
when Adam was so gracious to visit us as we were going through the museum, he mentioned that one of the things he was fascinated by was that the piece that they have in the museum, which is, I believe, Valentin
To Boulogne.
de Boulogne, and he has feathers on all these caps of people in his painting. And the only thing I could think of was to say, I am so grateful our museum has a new feather in its cap by having this exhibit. And I would even go so far as to say that, you know, I probably should give an allegorical feather to Larry and to Adam for their caps, because wouldn't you agree?
It's very, very kind. Now, I will say that, so two stories, one about the feather and then the other about the exhibition. So I was on a tour with Larry and rather wonderful 10-year-olds not that long ago. Not my 10-year-old, who's now 11, but another wonderful 10-year-old. And let me tell you, you know, a really good curator when the tour to the 10-year-old is as good as any other tour that you see. And he pointed out our Valentin de Bologna painting, which was in the Met retrospective of the artist, one of the great pictures, might have even been like marketing work for the show. I don't know. I look at Larry, I don't remember. It was very prominently featured. And that's one of the joys of lending our paintings, right? Sort of our reputation in the art world is there's one Toledo painting in every show and it's the best. So we'll come back to that in a bit. But here's this remarkable painting that has this remarkable feather. And now you can look at it next to one of Caravaggio's feathers. And as Larry pointed out, Caravaggio's feather wins. It's really, really a great feather. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those two. But it is worth saying the only reason an exhibition like this can happen is because of the quality of this collection. That every single one of the loans that we received because we were able to exact it as a reciprocal loan for a loan that we offered. So the musicians from the Metropolitan Museum of Art is only here because our Manet painting of Antonin Proust was lent to the Met and the Musée d'Orsay show, Manet Degas, which some of you might have seen in New York. But it was actually for that loan, we said, please give us the Caravaggio. And because they do many more shows than us, it also helps when you can say, we've lent you 29 paintings in the past decade, you've lent us 4. So we had a little bit of extra juice. So too with the DIA and the Wadsworth, with whom we've been very, very generous for a very long time. And in addition with the Kimball, to whom we lent very generously rather unstable painting, our Monet water lilies. So there was a big show that they did with San Francisco, and we lent it to them very generously. And after much negotiation and hand-wringing, we were able to bring that picture, which was the hardest to get, bringing us to 4 of the 5 paintings that are in America that Caravaggio painted in Rome. So very, very fortunate to have this exhibition. So just a little bit of kerfuffle back there, but we will keep going. So Bishop Thomas, Caravaggio is famous for not being such a calm and cool character. He probably spent more time in settings like the card sharps than we might care to admit. So I'm wondering if Caravaggio came to confession after having, say, thrown a plate of artichokes at a waiter and told you he'd done something silly like that, what might you have said to him?
Well, I think the priest in confession always responds to whatever the sin is and tries to address it in counsel by inviting the person to the virtue that would be the opposite of the vice that the person was confessing. So I guess if he confessed throwing a plate of artichokes, I would suggest that he serve his neighbor something in the future. But of course, I wouldn't be able to tell Adam any of that because the priest cannot reveal anything that happens in confession. Otherwise, you'd have to kill me.
Well, I certainly have no interest in doing that. So we're winding down on time. We started a little late, but the museum closes at 8 and we want to be sensitive to, that. So we're going to get you out here on one question, somewhat related.
Okay.
So the exhibition isn't just about 4 paintings by Caravaggio. The exhibition is also about the influence that Caravaggio spawned on so many other artists in that period and after. But in that period, those followers of Caravaggio became known as the so-called Caravaggisti. And it would be fair, and they're represented in the exhibition through remarkable works from our collection, many of which adorn the walls of this gallery, usually, which is sort of fashioned as a space for large-scale European paintings, a la the great European palaces and halls. Those Caravaggisti are, in their ways, disciples. So I'm curious, as someone who has dedicated your life to here in this community, you are a leader, but you are a follower, right? You are a follower of a faith, you are a follower of a religion. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the notion of discipleship and followership in your life and in your practice, and how you think about the Caravaggisti in the show in relation to that.
Good. I think that was a little different than the question I was presented. But I think I can weave them together.
Very good.
So obviously, a disciple is a follower of Jesus, and those who are all disciples are on mission, the mission of Jesus, to proclaim the gospel. It's interesting, we find ourselves as Catholics in this Lenten time when we prepare for Easter. And in this time, as disciples, we follow the one whose very first words in his ministry, public ministry, his very first words were repent and believe in the gospel. After Easter, there were 2 disciples who were walking away very disappointed because they didn't believe that what Jesus had promised had happened. And one of the Caravaggisti, which is in this museum, is Hendrik ter Brugghen, and he has a painting which, of course, is copied from one of Caravaggio's most famous, which is the road. It's called, I think it's called The Road to Emmaus. I believe that's the title. The Road to Emmaus, of course, is these 2 disciples post-resurrection who are traveling along, and suddenly Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, appears to them and they don't know it. And as disciples, we are meant to respond to the resurrection. So Jesus, of course, he goes through all of Scripture. They don't understand. They arrive to the place where they're meant to stay. They invite him in to the dinner. And at dinner, while he's breaking bread, he fundamentally, in the breaking of the bread, he's revealing what he had done at the Last Supper, which is to present the Holy Eucharist, the body and blood. And as he's breaking the bread, of course, suddenly they recognize him and he disappears. So I would say, as a disciple, that's the painting that drew me in the most, because it is disciples who are in their encounter with Jesus are suddenly recognizing him. And as we mentioned before, it's a moment that Caravaggio draws us in. And the moment is this revelation. I love the one disciple. That's who I like to place myself in his place. He's actually straining on the chair, and you can see he's so stunned. Maybe he's even about to fall off the chair. And I have to say that as a disciple myself, a follower who is called to be a shepherd, a leader, I'm always still that follower. And yet I'm the one who's called to break open the bread and the word and to follow the risen Jesus and to first have that encounter myself spiritually and to draw others into the encounter of the risen Jesus. And it's for that reason that that painting draws me in most deeply as a disciple, because then what were the disciples to do? They went right back in their tracks, back to announce the risen Jesus. And scripture scholars tell us, of course, that as they were going away from Jerusalem, they were going west. So the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. They were going west toward the darkness. When they realized who it was and had the encounter, they were going back toward the east and therefore toward the sunrise and the resurrection. So that's obviously my task as the shepherd of the flock, of the Diocese of Toledo, who I am so blessed and privileged to shepherd as bishop, and to be a fellow disciple along the way and lead them to the risen Christ.
And we are blessed and privileged to have you with us this evening. Everyone, a round of applause for Bishop Daniel E. So before we adjourn for the evening, and I thank you again so much, Bishop Thomas, for being here, and thank you all for being with us. But I also want to give a special thanks to the Toledo Museum of Art team who makes this happen and who clearly dealt with something quite significant right in the back there while we were working through it. And we hope that everyone ends up being okay. But thanks to the entire visitor experience and programs team who helped put this on, along with IT, to make sure that our mics didn't interfere with each other and we were well lit. So thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful weekend. Get home safely. Okay.